Okay, so thank you everyone for joining, and hope more people are going to join. So today it's my pleasure to have a Professor Silvestro, Daniele Silvestro from the University of Fribourg, to talk to us about AI and biodiversity. So he leads a group. So as I said, at the University of Fribourg, called the Silvestro Group. So I read from the description of his team. So they are specialized in computational evolutionary biology. Okay, and so they do a lot of research, but today it's more like how AI and machine learning are used to help for biodiversity. And I read of a couple of papers, on how Daniele and his team have used AI and machine learning to work on the red list, right? The red list of these endangered species, and this work is very fascinating. Okay, so I will take questions through Meetup. Okay, so that's why I asked you to sign up on Meetup, so because everybody is mute. I'm alone today for this meeting, so I cannot coordinate everything. But if you put your questions on Meetup, I read them, and Professor Silvestro will be Daniele will be able to answer them. Okay, so the floor is yours.
All right. Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting me to give this talk. So, yeah, as you mentioned, I'm a computational biologist, and in the research we do in our lab, we are trying to understand how biodiversity has evolved over time and how it may change in the future. I'm generally interested in understanding the dynamics of landscapes and how the organisms that live in them adapt to this changing environment. So in these three pictures, I show what my home region looks like today. Lots of vineyards. It's a place where Nutella was invented also, among other things. But if we go back like a few million years, this place would have looked probably like something in the image in the middle here, which is basically it was a shallow sea. The Mediterranean Sea was closed at that point, and it basically evaporated most of it. So it was a hyper salty and harsh environment. If we go further back in time, the very same place would have looked like something in the picture on the right, which is a subtropical coral reef, essentially. And so obviously the environment has changed dramatically over millions of years, and the life in it has changed accordingly. And so what we're trying to understand with our modeling is really how life adapts to these changing environments, how species originate and go extinct through this different environment. And then more recently, we've been working also on how our species coping with anthropogenic pressure, so with humans, which is a much more recent in time effect that impacts very strongly biodiversity worldwide. So the first thing that I would like to talk to you about is a model that we've been working on to understand how biodiversity evolves in deep time. So in time scales of millions of years before humans are even, in the picture. And in particular, one of the things we are interested in is how plant biodiversity has accumulated over time. Flowering plants are all over the place. They are the dominant plants across most ecosystems today, terrestrial ecosystems today. And there is more than 300,000 species of flowering plants that are known today, plus many more that are known in the fossil record also. Flowering plants have been around for a very long time. So they were there when the dinosaurs were there. They probably originated somewhere around 150 millions of years ago. But in the fossil record, if you look at the fossils of flowering plants, they kind of show up all of a sudden toward the end of the Cretaceous, which is the end of the period of at the end of which dinosaurs went extinct. And so ever since Darwin, scientists have been a bit puzzled about how this very diverse group of organisms has appeared in the fossil record kind of all of a sudden. And what was the history behind that? Like, when did angiosperms or flowering plants originate, and how did their biodiversity accumulate over time? So there are some snapshots of the evolution of flowering plants that can be analyzed through the fossil record. For example, in a recent study, we looked at the fossil record just before and just after the meteorite that hit Earth 66 million years ago, at which point all dinosaurs went extinct. And we were able to determine, looking at this fossil record and analyzing them using a Bayesian framework, we were able to estimate how species originated and went extinct around this point in time. And through this Bayesian analysis, we were able to determine that the tropical forests, as we know them today, so with this highly stratified canopy where we have, plants in the understory, and then taller trees, and then trees at the very that occupy the very top of the canopy. So this stratified canopy, this stratified tropical forest, basically originated from the ashes of this mass extinction. So there was this huge destruction worldwide that affected all of life on Earth, and from these angiosperms so flowering plants became the most abundant plant group on Earth, even though they had existed before for a very long time. So there are some cases where we can use modeling coupled with a very rich fossil record, like here, to establish at least some of the evolutionary history of a long-lived group of organisms like flowering plants. But what about everything else? This is like a time window of few millions of years, but angiosperms, so the flowering plants, have been around for 150 million years. So how did their biodiversity accumulate beyond this one point in time that we now know quite well? And scientists have been asking this question for a long time, and not only for plants, but for many other groups. How does biodiversity change over time? Is, for example, the number of species today, which is estimated to be several millions of organisms on Earth, is this biodiversity the highest that has ever existed in the history of life? Or has it increased over time? Has it, has it reached a maximum and remained stable for a while? So there are a number of fundamental questions in evolutionary biology that depend on our understanding of how biodiversity evolves over time. So it would be great if we could make these plots and estimate how diversity for different groups of organisms has evolved over time.
Daniele, can I ask you, so what is the scale of the y-axis? These are thousands or millions?
So the y-axis here is the number of sampled genera or number of sampled organisms. So it's not attempting to reconstruct the absolute number of organisms or species, but it's some sort of relative measure. And that is because this is basically obtained from the fossil record. If we do some raw count of how many organisms are found across the last 600 or 400 millions of years, this is what the curve would look like. This is obviously a sort of relative estimate.
And then, so
but ideally,
I cannot compare the 1,000 and the 600 of the plant. So these numbers are not comparable, are they?
Not really, because they will depend on a number of things. They will depend on how likely it is a plant to leave a fossil record compared to a marine invertebrate, for example.
And the x-axis is a million of years, right? 600 million.
The x-axis is millions of years, yes. So these attempts have been done for a long time in paleontology and in evolutionary biology, and they are based on some sort of simple counts of biodiversity obtained or observed in the fossil record. And to some degree, there is also some modeling that can go into these estimations. So the most direct evidence that we have today for past biodiversity is in the fossil record. So we can go out there, dig out some fossils, count how many species we observe at different points in time, and use that to estimate, to make an estimate of how many different organisms lived at that point in time. So there are some models, relatively simple models using rarefaction or assuming random sampling that attempt to estimate from this incomplete fossil record the true diversity, the true biodiversity. But the problem is that the fossil record is extremely incomplete, and it's incomplete in a very biased way. So there are biases that affect at taxonomic levels. So there are some organisms that fossilize much more than others. You can imagine a big, heavy dinosaur will be more likely to leave a fossil record compared to a jellyfish or an epiphytic plant. There are also temporal biases because it's much easier to find fossils that are recent than fossils that are really ancient. And finally, there are very many problems when looking at spatial biases because there are biomes on Earth that are much less likely to preserve a fossil record than others. For example, if an organism dies in a tropical forest, it will be eaten and decomposed in no time. Whereas if it preserves under the sediments of a deep ocean, it will stay there forever. So there are lots of biases, and it's really hard to take them into account while estimating the true diversity. And in fact, there have been a couple of papers recently showing that with the current models, this true biodiversity through time is essentially unidentifiable based on the fossil record. So the approach that we're trying to take here is attempting to solve this problem, and is doing so by coupling mechanistic generative models that describe our understanding of biodiversity and the fossilization process with the power of deep learning modeling. So this software that is in development, and the project is being led by a PhD student in my group, Rebecca Cooper. In this model, we have we call deep dive for deep learning diversity estimation. So we have a component that implements mechanistic generative models, and one of which, in one module here, basically simulates biodiversity based on our understanding of how biodiversity changes over time. And the other module here implements mechanistic models of how fossils preserve through time and across space. So we use birth-death stochastic processes to generate biodiversity histories of clades, of groups of organisms, under a spatial explicit context. So we can track where these species live and for how long and when they go extinct. And so from this, we can basically count the number of species through time, and this will be our ground truth. This is basically what we want to estimate at the end. And then we have this fossilization and sampling module that uses stochastic models of fossilization. So that represents what we know about the possible spatial, temporal, and taxonomic biases that can affect the fossil record. And now we generate a number of features or data points that are these fossil occurrences. They will be incomplete and biased in all possible ways that we can imagine. And we have a ground truth. And then the next step will be to map this data onto this output. And we do that by recurrent neural networks, because this is essentially time series that we're looking at. And so these mechanistic models are coupled with deep learning models that we use for estimation. And through these simulations, because we produce both the input data and the labels, the output, we are able to use this framework to train models that learn how to recognize patterns in the fossil record and map them onto true biodiversity estimations. So this is work in progress. So I'm not gonna provide new estimates for how many dinosaurs were out there in the past, for example, or how many flowering plants. But so far, we are running simulations to validate our framework, and it looks like the framework is accurate. We get high test accuracy across many simulations under a range of settings. And we are clearly getting the signal from the data, even though this input biased fossil record is a very incomplete picture of the true diversity. The next step will be, which as I said is not done yet, but the next step will be to use these trained models. So these models that are trained through our mechanistic understanding of evolutionary processes. So the next step will be to use these trained models with empirical fossil data to estimate diversity trajectories of actual clades. And hopefully we will figure out whether the diversity of flowering plants today is at its highest, or how it has changed throughout its history. So with these models, we are aiming to understand the deep time history of biodiversity. So we're talking about millions of years. But unfortunately, we are living right now at a moment where biodiversity is changing really quickly. And so with timescales that are not even close to these millions of years that we've been seeing in these examples. And these extinctions that are affecting biodiversity today, they have been going on for a very short time in evolutionary terms, and they can be attributed to humans, essentially. And so this is another thing that we're really interested in, and we have been looking at very recent extinctions of organisms. In this case, we looked at mammals. And again, using Bayesian modeling, we were able to use these extinction times estimated from historical record and from fossil record through time. And in this plot, we have a log transform time axis. So we log transform it so that we can stretch a bit more the recent times. And on the y-axis, we have a gray plot showing here how the diversity of mammal species has changed over this amount of time. And you can see how strongly it has decreased over time. So we lost hundreds and hundreds of species, mammal species. And this is a Bayesian estimation of how the extinction rates have increased over time. So in the last 60,000 years, which is nothing in evolutionary terms, it's a very short time in evolutionary terms, the extinction rates in mammals have increased 1,700 times. And to put this in context, basically, if the rate hadn't changed from what it was 60,000 years ago, we would have to wait almost 2 million years to reach the number of extinctions that we observe instead in 60,000 years. So the magnitude of this extinction is really big. We can also use Bayesian predictive modeling
sorry, Daniel.
Yes,
how
please.
does it compare to that meteorite? Could the meteorite, like, hit the Earth? The biodiversity also fell by a lot, right? Probably because everything disappears. So we are kind of modern meteorite, like kind of a second meteorite happening to Earth, right? So
yeah. So there is a debate about this, but it is what is going on right now has, at least in terms of extinction rate, has the magnitude of a mass extinction. Oh. It is not yet a mass extinction because we thankfully have not lost 70% of all mammals. We have lost a few hundreds out of a few thousands. So it's not too late to stop this from being a mass extinction. But the magnitude of the extinction rates is certainly that of a mass extinction. So it's not, it hasn't gone on for long enough to be a mass extinction yet, thankfully. And maybe we can do something about that in the future. Yeah, as I was saying, like this drop in diversity can also be, we can use posterior predictive modeling to show that human population growth alone can explain 95% of these recent mammal extinctions. So even if we factor in climate change, because of course there is also ice ages going on in the meantime, but human population growth alone can explain 95% of mammal extinctions. So this is the recent past, but biodiversity is not doing very well in the present either.
Is that true also by region, by continents? If you look at the population growth in Africa versus Asia versus America, so there's a kind of correlation between the two.
Yes, and in fact, if you look at this curve across different continents, you will see that this curve, even the extinction rates, estimated from the data, you will see that the extinction rates have changed very differently in different continents depending on human arrival, essentially. So the Americas have a much later extinction peak compared to Eurasia or Australia, where like people or humans arrived much earlier.
Okay, thank you.
So that further corroborates the fact that it is humans really driving this extinction. And biodiversity today is not doing very well either. So this is recent extinctions, but there is a lot of species that are not extinct, but they are threatened. And so the IUCN compiles this red list of that is classifying species into different levels of threat. They go from least concern to near threatened, vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered. So this is like increasing levels of extinction risk. And we can use, again, we can use Bayesian modeling to make predictions for the future of how this classification will change in the future. This is something that we did with birds, because birds are very well known, and they are all of the bird species are classified by the IUCN red list. And using predictive modeling, we can show that we expect a fourfold increase in the number of bird species that will be threatened in 100 years. So all else being equal, if we don't change the course of action, we will have many more endangered or maybe even extinct species, bird species, in 100 years from now. For birds, we can do this because birds are very well known and very well studied. But what about all the other millions of species that are out there? There is tons of species that are maybe arguably less charismatic, or at least lesser known compared to birds. And those are oftentimes not classified by the red list, because for each of them, you will need experts manually assessing their conservation status. And so to address this problem, and of course, it's crucial to understand how many species and which species are endangered to be able to design conservation action. And so we've recently developed a deep learning approach to use online data about species and species occurrences to predict basically this threat status. So we can use deep neural networks in occurrence data that are available online, and there are billions of occurrence data actually out there on online databases. So we can use these deep neural networks to make a prediction for which and how many species are endangered today. And we apply this to trees. There are 68,000 species of trees in the world, and there are thousands and thousands of them that are actually endangered today. About 40% of trees may be endangered as of today, and we can also map where most species are endangered on Earth. Obviously, these will correspond to places that are also very diverse, like the tropics. But doing these types of predictions across many thousands of species will hopefully guide a little bit our conservation efforts. Right, so this is these are ways to assess how biodiversity is doing today. And the last thing that I would like to talk to you about is a project where we looked at what can we do to basically protect species, and what can we do?
Can I ask Daniel, on your previous slide, the factors that the kind of features that you use, right, for your model. So in Brazil, so if the president of Brazil is very favorable to the farmers and the farming community and so on, you'll see more deforestation and more impact on biodiversity. So how do you control this political, what the human intervention, right? Because the government can say, okay, you are not allowed, or you say, okay, you are allowed to do it, and then it's going to change a lot, right? Okay.
Yes, so this is something that is difficult to factor in these models. So what we can use is some layers of human footprint. So the level of disturbance basically that we have across space. But with these models, it's not obvious how the temporal aspect basically plays out, or it's difficult to integrate it. And it is difficult to integrate unfortunate policies that are being used in multiple countries, including Brazil, about conservation. So that's not something that can be easily incorporated in these predictions. But this maybe comes in the next model that I will, in the last model that I want to talk about today, which is basically starting with this in mind. So knowing that there are thousands of species that are at risk of extinction, and that the resources for protecting biodiversity are limited. What can we do to basically best protect this biodiversity while incorporating this information about this rapidly changing world, including, for example, political action or inaction, and including the fact that there is a limited budget that can be spent realistically on conservation. And so in this project, we teamed up with biologists, economists, and computer scientists, these lovely people shown here, to develop a model that attempts to tackle this. And the model is implemented in a program called CAPTAIN for Conservation Area Prioritization through Artificial Intelligence. And it was recently published in a paper in Nature Sustainability. And so here we are basically implementing a reinforcement learning framework to optimize conservation policies. So reinforcement learning is typically used to solve dynamic problems like playing a game, for example, or teaching a robot how to walk. In this case, the game they were playing is protecting biodiversity. And the software implements two modules. One that basically incorporates a simulated natural system where we, again, put in mechanistic models of how we think biodiversity may react to anthropogenic pressure, but also climate change, and how this will affect biodiversity through time. And I will say a few more things about this natural system in the next slide. This system, so this environment, is being monitored through a monitoring policy that extracts information from the system. This system will include species richness, population sizes, species ranges, so geographic ranges, but also genetic diversity and other variables. So this system is being monitored and translated into a protection policy. So the agent here is essentially the policymaker, that with a limited budget will have to play the game in the best possible way by placing protected areas in this wider region towards meeting a target. And the target can be, for example, to protect the highest number of species. So the simulated system implements, is basically an individual-based, spatially explicit simulation of biodiversity that describes how biodiversity and species may move around in space, how they reproduce, how they die. So we have a mortality, a birth process, and a dispersal process that describe how species move around and change in their population size. But we also have other factors like anthropogenic disturbance and climate. And both of these things will change over time. So this is how the system may evolve over time. And you see there is climate that is changing in a stochastic way, but also following some trend, for example, toward warming. Disturbance is simulated to be increasing over time. So disturbance is really human pressure on the environment, and disturbance will affect the number of individuals that can live in a place and the number in which species can live in a given cell in this area, this simulated area. In this framework, we can simulate millions of individuals, thousands of species, so we can scale the system up to realistic levels. We can see that as the disturbance increases, then species will tend to disappear from areas that are exposed to high disturbance. And these squares here are the protected areas that are being placed by the policymaker, by the agent. Some species will survive in protected areas. Some species will survive also outside the protected areas because maybe they're less sensitive to anthropogenic pressure. Some species will go extinct anyway, even though they were in protected areas, maybe because they're affected by climate change, where protection is not helping, essentially. So this is how the system evolves. And then the system feeds into a monitoring policy that is basically extracting features from this system. For example, number of species per cell, population trends, and other variables. And these variables basically reflect what we can actually monitor in a real landscape. So what a scientist, can, with the type of data that a scientist can go out there and collect in the real world. Then we use a deep neural network here to translate basically these features into action. And the action will be selecting the next area. And this will also take into account the budget that we have. So this framework is trained basically through multiple simulations. And we can show that a captain policy trained through reinforcement learning will outperform naive policies, for example, where we have where we just protect the most biodiverse areas. So this will not do a good job because it will not account for like the complementarity of different areas. And it will outperform a random selection of areas also. We benchmark this framework against the state-of-the-art software for conservation planning, which is called Marksan. So this is another software that is not based on AI. And we saw with simulations that our framework outperforms Marksan in most of our simulations, and it reduces species loss at the end of the simulation by 10–20%. We also, once we train a model, we can then use it with empirical data. And this is an experiment that we did with a data set of 1,500 tree species from Madagascar. So these are endemic species of trees. I guess the most famous tree in Madagascar is the baobab. There is many others, 1,500 of them. And so we have all these diversity data, spatially explicit. And then we also have maps of threat, like human pressure on the environment, and costs, like how much does it cost to protect an area. We can use one of these trained policies and obtain a conservation priority, basically map from Captain. We can then compare this outcome with the outcome that we would get with the same limited budget from a different software, Marksan. So here we have 22,000 possible units that we that we have to choose from, and the budget limits us to choosing up to 10% of them. And ideally, we want to conserve 10% of a species range for all species in our selected cells, right? So we do this experiment with Captain, and we see that we can indeed protect, with this budget, we can protect almost all species. And for almost all species, we actually exceed the target of protecting at least 10% of their range. Conversely, if we run with the same budget, this alternative software, we see that the protection is not as effective as the one obtained with reinforcement learning. So it looks like even with empirical data, we can actually outperform the state of the art using this reinforcement learning framework. The maps that we get are also arguably more interpretable than what we obtained, at least by running this other software.
I think there's Jacob.
Yes,
maybe wants to ask a question. So Jacob, you want to pick up?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi. Yes, please.
Hi, hi, Daniela. So it's striking to me the plot you showed a couple of slides ago, where just preserving random areas seems to do better. Yeah, this one, than the most biodiverse areas, and I'm wondering why that is. I mean, are random areas surprisingly good, or are most biodiverse areas really bad?
Yeah, most biodiverse areas are really bad because because biodiversity is distributed heterogeneously in space. So if you only protect the places with the highest biodiversity, you will end up protecting many times the same species. So okay, if you have to choose a single cell, it is obviously better to choose the most biodiverse cell. But if you choose many cells, then it's not a good idea to just choose them based on species richness, because you will not keep into account the complementarity, right, of what you're protecting. So this is obviously a very naive policy. That's why we also compare it with more elaborate methods as implemented in Marxan.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So we are also currently looking at the effects of applying this as a global policy versus a regional policy. So the results that I showed were basically allocating the budget to Madagascar as one place. And the solution that we found that it was allocating costs, but also benefits in terms of like where the protected areas ended up being in a very heterogeneous way, which means that if you look at regions within Madagascar or other, political boundaries within Madagascar, then the distribution of costs and benefits will be very heterogeneous. So we are now starting to compare basically the trade-offs between applying, instead of a global policy, a regional policy, and how this and the results basically that we get from a regional policy where the costs are distributed much more uniformly across the area, and also the amount of protected area is also distributed more uniformly. So we're trying to figure out how this affects the final outcome. So the global target is still to protect all the species at 10% of their range. But we see that if we apply the policy, if we constrain the policy to regional boundaries, then we lose some of the species. So we are not able to protect as well all the species. But on the other hand, there is maybe benefits for the people living in different regions, because they can all benefit from having a protected area with nature close to them. So I think this framework can also allow us to explore the different trade-offs between and basically decide basically what's the best way to allocate budgets in protecting biodiversity. So just to conclude, I think Captain is a future-proof approach for conservation planning using reinforcement learning, because it can use multidimensional input data, including species richness, but also genetic diversity. We can take into account carbon uptake, economic value, a number of things. And because it estimates a policy that evolves over time, it can also incorporate basically future climate change and land use changes. So if these layers of data are available, and they are for many regions, then they can be potentially used in these policies. The other nice thing of this approach is that we can train models toward different goals. So we can train models to protect the highest number of species, or train the model to maximize the carbon storage, or to maximize the amount of area that is protected. And by doing this, we can measure basically the trade-offs between favoring one axis versus another one. Yeah, so basically the work that we're doing in my lab is trying to understand how biodiversity has evolved over time, and how it will change, how it has changed in the recent past, and how it may change in the future. And we're also trying to apply AI technologies to hopefully improve the picture for future biodiversity. The idea here is that we're coupling mechanistic models. So we're applying what we know from a biological perspective of how things evolve, how things change. And we couple that with black box models based on deep learning. And I think that this coupling of mechanistic models with AI is actually a good approach to understand evolutionary biology and to improve conservation biology. With this, I would like to thank all of you for listening, and all the people in my lab, former members included, who contributed to a lot of the stuff that I showed today. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. That's fantastic. Let me stop the recording now.